So Donald Trump is now the president of the United States, which means he has a lot of things to focus on from his agenda, from mass deportations to imposing tariffs to even maybe taking Greenland. It's a long list of goals and items on his list that he needs to get done. But to get any of it through, he's going to need a large team of people to help him get his things achieved. But as we've covered here on the Ishaan S show previously, some of the people Trump has been picking are, let's say, unique. People with all sorts of interesting backgrounds, from Fox News hosts to people that have shot their own dogs. And so we here at the Ishaan S show are going to do some of the heavy lifting for you and introduce you to the men and women who are going to make decisions about your life every single day. We'll talk about notable moments from their careers, their backgrounds, and stuff any ordinary person probably wouldn't want their boss to know about. This is an Ishaan S show miniseries, Meet the Trump Administration. So for the second episode, we are talking about the Department of Defense, which I'm sure most of viewers, I think all viewers, are very familiar with, okay? Some fast facts about the Department of Defense. It is the largest government agency in the United States, by far the largest. It's also reflected in its budget with a budget of $841 billion with a B dollars. Oversees around 3.4 million service members and civilians in its personnel. Has a global presence around the world with 4,800 sites in 160 countries, and includes 6 branches: the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, and Coast Guard. So it's a very large department, okay? I'm going to read you 2 resumes now, and I want you to compare these 2 resumes because they both have the commonality of being Secretary of Defense at some point. And I want you to just think about the differences and similarities in these resumes, okay? First resume: served as Director of Central Intelligence Agency and Deputy National Security Advisor, President of Texas A&M University, served nearly 27 years in the CIA, and had roles on the National Security Council. That's the first resume. Second resume: former Army National Guard officer, leader of veterans charities including Vets for Freedom and Concerned Veterans for America, which face allegations of financial mismanagement, and a weekend Fox News host known for his conservative commentary. Very different resumes, I will remark. The first resume is that of former Secretary of Defense under Bush 43 and Obama, Robert Gates. And the second resume I just read to you is that of Pete Hegseth. Now, on paper, both of them have very different resumes, but ultimately it caps off probably reaching the pinnacle of both their careers. I'm not going to get ahead of either of them, but right now, as of right now, the topmost job at the bottom of those, or I guess at the top of those resumes, is the role of Secretary of Defense, overseeing this very large department. And so today's episode, we are going to talk about the man that is now leading that Department of Defense, the Pentagon, as we all love to call it, because of the building that it's in. And that's Pete Hegseth. We're going to talk about his background. We're going to talk about some of the things in his career. And a lot of you probably have heard about him because, in all honesty, he was never expected to be picked to be Secretary of Defense. It's kind of random that he even was considered for this role. But the fact that he was even picked sparked a lot of backlash from a lot of people because of a few things in his background. And so those are some of the stories I want to cover today. So let's move to story number 1. And story number 1 is probably where you've heard the most about him, and that has to do with his conduct. So Pete Hegseth has this really long history of conduct issues. That's what I'm calling it, conduct issues. And it ranges from a few different allegations that have spanned over the past few years. starting with allegations of sexual misconduct. Pretty serious. In 2017, there was an accusation that Pete Hegseth forced himself on and made unwanted advances and attempted to force himself onto her. This was at a conference that happened in that happened where this allegation was made. It allegedly took place in a hotel room where Hegseth and that woman were staying for an event. That's what you need to know. That is the allegation that was made. And it was a pretty big part of what happened or a pretty big part of the stories that came out when we learned more about Pete Hegseth after his nomination to be Secretary of Defense. For his part, Hegseth has denied the allegations, saying that the encounter was consensual and that he was being unfairly targeted. There was an internal investigation that was conducted by police and by others. Investigation was conducted, and it did not lead to charges. Ultimately, Hegseth was not found liable for anything. However, this incident really did damage Hegseth's reputation and raised questions about his conduct and his behavior. Because no matter what happened, because there's different accounts, conflicting accounts of exactly what happened. You can do some research on that. New Yorker did a very in-depth piece talking about this. I suggest you go read that. But there is a lot of confusion as to exactly what the real facts are in this case. But even then, just the allegation coming forward, and that too, such a detailed allegation, does spark questions about judgment, conduct, whatever it is. This whole ordeal for Hegseth ended with a $50,000 non-disclosure agreement settlement. Basically, that woman got paid $50,000 to keep quiet about what happened, not to speak on this issue, on anything related to this situation. And apparently Trump's team was caught pretty off guard by this allegation that was made against Hegseth. They did not know that this had happened. They didn't even know that there was an NDA involved. But that is one of the allegations. Then there's another allegation of domestic abuse with Pete Hegseth. So right before his vote to be confirmed as Secretary of Defense, Hegseth's now ex-sister-in-law, the ex-wife of his brother, alleged to senators that Hegseth was abusive towards his second wife. She said that apparently, it's alleged, that Hegseth got so abusive towards his second wife that she had to come up with a safe word with her sister-in-law to call in case she needed help. And it was with her sister-in-law and another individual. Hegseth, for his part, has also denied this allegation, but it should be noted that this one-time sister-in-law of Pete Hegseth, who made this allegation of this whole thing under oath to senators right before Pete Hegseth's confirmation. Like, this was something that she said under oath. She called him, quote, erratic and aggressive, in addition to that whole anecdote. And allegedly, Hegseth's ex-wife did actually text the sister-in-law this code word once in 2015 or 2016. It's not clear what year that was. So that is something to know, but it's not just that allegation. There's also this whole instance with Hegseth's own mom, who criticized his treatment of women. In an email to her son, she wrote that he was, quote, an abuser of women who belittles, lies, cheats, sleeps around, and uses women for his own power and ego. She told him to, quote, get some help and take an honest look at yourself. Hegseth's mom, Penelope Hegseth, has since apologized to Secretary Hegseth for what she said and has disavowed those statements. But come on, like, that's pretty big. Like, that's a pretty big deal. But she has since done that. So that's allegations of domestic abuse. And then there's allegations of alcohol abuse. So there have been instances of alcohol abuse that have spanned a lot of Hegseth's career, but one in particular, one report that I want to look at is one that was done by NBC News, which interviewed 10 former Fox News colleagues who noted that they were concerned about Hegseth's excessive drinking, and because there were instances where he was visibly intoxicated and engaged in disruptive and offensive behavior. Some of the things that were alleged include that they smelled alcohol on him before he went on air on Fox News. They said he talked about being on the air hungover. He missed scheduled appearances because he was drunk. Hegseth, of course, has also denied all of these allegations. So there's so much on Hegseth when it comes to all these unique allegations when it comes to his conduct, his personal conduct. And I don't know, this is your judgment to make exactly what you think of his behavior. But indeed, these allegations do exist, and they were all examined, and Republican senators seem to sign on and go along with it. I mean, the whole thing with his ex-sister-in-law, who came out with her story about Hegseth's second wife, this was just out literally days before he was supposed to be confirmed to be Secretary of Defense. And she was under the assumption that if she brought out this story, that he may not be even confirmed. That's why she went on oath and even said this. Of course, you are innocent until proven guilty, and most, and if not all, of these cases have been adjudicated. And adjudicated not in a legal sense, but they have been looked at, they've been dealt with, and they're not things that Hegseth is looking at himself right now, but they are stuff to make note of. But that is story number one. Story number two is a little different, but has to do from his time as a Fox News host, and it has to do with war criminals. That's something interesting for the Secretary of Defense. So apparently, Hegseth has this whole history of advocating for pardoning service people accused of war crimes. I'll explain. So when Hegseth was a Fox News host, he was very close with President Trump at the time in his first term, and he was a big advocate for and was publicly advocating for pardoning military personnel who were accused of war crimes. This included specific cases with a Navy SEAL, an Army major, and Hegseth was very vocal in his advocacy to get these people pardoned because, in his view, there are instances where service members make decisions that they get dragged into. I'm going to read a quote from him. He said, quote, "In some cases, our units were so boxed in by rules and regulations and political correctness, we even second-guessed ourselves." This is what he said in himself when it came to his experience when he was in the military, because he did serve as an Army National Guard officer, like I said at the top. But that is what he said about when it came to the issues of military ethics and war crimes. Some military officers are actually worried that Hegseth was saying stuff like this. His outspoken advocacy to pardon these alleged and, in many cases, adjudicated war criminals really sparked concern among these military officers, and some were worried. According to NBC News, they were worried that he would turn a blind eye to U.S. war crimes. One military officer said his statements, quote, "should be disqualifying." There's this whole issue of military ethics, and this is something that I think we should all pay attention to when it comes from a Secretary of Defense. This issue of military ethics not necessarily being looked at with as big of a scrutiny-filled eye than maybe we would be comfortable looking at. This is also someone who has previously questioned the Geneva Code of Human Rights. That's the charter that countries around the world have signed detailing what human rights should be and what counts and doesn't count as a human rights violation. He's openly questioned that, and that is something that he has done. So combined with this whole advocacy for pardoning war criminals thing, it's a little iffy and dicey necessarily about exactly what this experience looks like. But that is another one of the things. His intervention came in the first Trump term when he was a Fox News host. And as you know, Donald Trump is very influenced by Fox News hosts. So yeah, that's story number 2. Story number 3 has to do with people in combat, but in a very, very, very different sense. And this has to do with women in combat. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play an interview that Pete Hegseth had discussing women in combat, and then I'll see you on the other side, and we'll talk about exactly what he said.
Because I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated.
So the video you just saw was Hegseth criticizing the idea of women in combat. And this was just days before he was nominated to be Secretary of Defense, of which are 20% of our service ranks are women. So that's something to note. The quote, "Dads push us to take risks. Moms put the training wheels on our bikes. We need moms, but not in the military, especially in combat units," is so reflective of, I would argue, his views, his philosophy, his beliefs, and I think his approach to maybe being Secretary of Defense. And these are not statements. I mean, since then, since he was nominated, Hegseth has evolved in his thinking and has altered just a little bit his views on women in combat, and has become more open and is a lot more in favor of standards, specific standards that outline what women in combat roles should do, or who should be in combat roles. And women can qualify for those standards, obviously, but he's changed his thinking ever since being nominated to be Secretary of Defense. It's been criticized as discriminatory, sexist, problematic. I mean, this guy has questionable histories with women in the first story we talked about, but in this story, this has to do with women in combat. And I think it is worth noting just exactly how controversial it might be to say something like that, especially just days before you are nominated to be Secretary of Defense. But he's since obviously has evolved in his thinking 32 days before his confirmation hearings, as Senator Elizabeth Warren pointed out during those hearings. But what I want to do is I want to play a clip of Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, who just went after Hegseth for his statements about women in combat. And yeah, take a listen.
Cannot denigrate women in general, and your statements do that. We don't want women in the military, especially in combat. What a terrible statement. So please, do not deny that you've made those statements. You have. We take the responsibility of standards very seriously, and we will work with you. I'm equally distressed you would not meet with me before this hearing. We could have covered all of this before you came here, so I could get to the 15 other questions that I want to get to. In your statement, you don't want politics in the DOD. Everything you've said in these public statements is politics. I don't want women, I don't want moms. What's wrong with a mom, by the way? Once you have babies, you therefore are no longer able to be lethal? I mean, you're basically saying women, after they have children, can't ever serve in the military in a combat role. It's a silly thing to say. It's a silly thing to say, beneath the position that you are aspiring to.
So she really went after him there. And I don't know what you think about women in combat. I think it's more about a standards thing. If you fit the standards, then you should be more than willing to serve, and you should serve. I guess Pete Hegseth had different views, maybe not anymore, but I don't know. The time between him first voicing these opinions and then to the point where he changed them is a lot more than the time since he's changed them to becoming Secretary of Defense, because he very conveniently shifted views just as soon as the confirmation hearings came up. But anyway, that is story number 3. Story number 3 about opposition to women in combat roles. Let's move to story number 4. So as I said at the top, the Department of Defense has a nearly $1 trillion budget. Like, they have the biggest budget and probably one of the biggest budgets of a government agency in the world. I don't think the US military matches in how big it is compared to any organization on earth. $1 trillion, like, that's a lot of mine and yours money. And it should be handled properly. And I would want the person who's responsible for that money to be well qualified and have experience. Thing is, with Pete Hegseth, he does not really possess that sort of background of managing a 3 million person organization. Most people don't, for that matter, in his defense. But when looking around in his resume, we don't really have much about his background other than being a Fox News host. Like, that's primarily what he's known for. But he does have some executive level experience, and that was when he was at the helm of two veterans charities, Vets for Freedom and Concerned Veterans for America. I read that at the top when I was reading Pete Hegseth's resume. But what I also noted in that resume is that both of these organizations faced allegations of financial mismanagement. That's something worth noting, because Hegseth is about to is leading the largest government budget in the country, like by far the largest. So when we look at some of his background as being an executive responsible for a budget and making sure that money is spent, I want you to know a little bit about that. So at Veterans for Freedom, for example, when he took over as executive director of this organization, its revenue was $8.7 million. It's nothing compared to the $841 billion budget of the Department of Defense, but 8.7 million is still a lot of money. And at that point, the skills that you show, I'm sure, carry on into the skills that show with that large of a budget. But when he took over, it was 8.7 million. By the time he left Vets for Freedom, that revenue ran down to $265,000. Wow. $8.7 million to $265,000. Those are public disclosures. And in addition to that, they ran a $400,000 deficit and $75,000 in credit card debt. Of course, by the time we got the $265,000 figure, Pete Hegseth was no longer the executive director. He was an officer in the organization. But nonetheless, leadership in an organization that went from $8.7 million to $265,000 should raise eyebrows. There were complaints about a lack of financial oversight. Critics point that this lack of accountability within these organizations led to the questions about how their donations were being spent from donors. High salaries and bonuses is what is being reported. Hegseth and other top executives received high salaries and high bonuses, which some donors felt were excessive given the organization's mission, as well as what they aimed to, the amount of money that they worked with. They also had these questionable fundraising practices. It's alleged. There were questions about transparency, about the ethics of fundraising. Some donors felt like they were maybe misled. But yeah, that's with Vets for Freedom. The other organization, Hegseth was actually forced out of, allegedly, for all sorts of conduct. We talked about conduct earlier, but it's similar kind of conduct and allegations, but also for financial handling. But yeah, like, the guy that's going to be responsible for 841 billion US taxpayer dollars is also the same guy who was in leadership at an organization whose revenue went from $8.7 million to $265,000. So that should put into perspective some of the work that we might want to expect out of our Secretary of Defense. But that's story number 4. And with that, that is a look at Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. We're going to keep watching how Secretary Hegseth does. I know in this Trump administration, he's going to be very involved in a lot of senses, so we'll be covering him here on the Ishaan S Show. But that's a little bit of his background, a little bit of some stories about his past. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments what you think about his background, his career, anything that you think I missed out on. If you liked my commentary, then please go ahead and subscribe to the Ishaan S Show. Don't forget to listen to our daily episode, our bi-weekly episodes on Wednesdays and Saturdays. If you liked my commentary, also go check out the IshaanSshow.com. Follow us on social media, and tune in every Tuesday for new editions of Meet the Trump Administration. But until the next one, I think we're working on that. We're working to see who we're going to cover next. But thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you in the next one.